even here in Canada, I think many people would have learned more from graphic novels in general. Because and don't feel bad about it, because here's a funny story. Like, not many people, even in Canada, know about the things I cover in my book. So that's the thing. I think people outside of Canada might think that I'm sort of like talking about some secret Canadian thing that only Canadians know about. But in fact, a lot of this stuff is really completely unknown. And I guess that's sort of something against the education system, but it's also, I mean, it hasn't really been written about it's been written about to some degree, but not to a great deal. So that's something against publishing as well. It's something against journalism. It's actually kind of remarkable that sort of like such an important part of something that really shook Canada has really not been covered to like any great length.
It's not just interesting from a historical perspective, but it's obviously very narratively compelling. It's the kind of thing you think that, there would have been some big film about, or what's your sense of why it just hasn't gotten out there in that way?
The thing is, so this group, the FLQ, which is it was a separatist group, but to distinguish it, it was sort of separatism by means of violence. So there's sort of two periods of this group. There's sort of this better-known version in 1970 where they actually kidnapped politicians, and one was killed. So there's that, and that's kind of like a better-known version. And there actually have been like some film adaptations in Canada about it. Not many, but other adaptations. And that was going to be the book I was originally going to do when I started this, because I knew about it. I knew a little bit about what happened before, but as soon as I started doing research about the earlier period, I was flabbergasted by what I was learning. And then I realized pretty quickly that this is it. This is the book. There's going to be a book 2. And I will do like this later period in 1970. But for now, I just had to cover that 1960s period, because it really is an unknown. Much of it is unknown.
That moment when you realize that, this is going to be multiple books that are going to take, multiple years of your life.
Right.
Obviously, you've got a lot of experience from the publishing side of things.
Well, I mean, on a practical level, like, I'm getting older, so there's no guarantee I'll be alive.
This is such a graphic novel cartoonist thing, and anybody over the age of like 20 is like, well, I'm gonna die soon.
Yeah, I mean, no, seriously. I'm 57, so like, there's no guarantee I'm going to be around in 6 or 7 years, which is at least how long it's going to take me to finish this next one. But yeah, so there's that issue. I mean, on the other hand, like this second and last book, like what happens in the second book is also like completely fascinating. So I'm really like excited to start working in that full time. I've sort of done the drafts of it and so on. So that part I'm really looking forward to. And like I said, I hope I can finish it without
without keeling over on your drawing desk. You allude to this at the end, but anytime you're writing any piece of history, certain things are going to have to be condensed and changed. And you mention a few of the things that for various reasons didn't make it into this book. I'm sure when you had the realization that you wanted to cover the earlier time period, you were wondering whether it was something that you could fit into a single volume.
I knew pretty much that I could fit it into a single volume, because it basically covers 3 periods of the FLQ. The crazy thing is that there are these different groups that wanted to overthrow the Canadian government.
It was the 60s, man.
Yeah. Yeah, so they were all unconnected. So like one group, and they didn't know each other too. So like one group would have their kind of haphazard, bumbling plan to do something, and then they would get arrested and thrown in jail. And then a year later, another group would come along, and then they would try their own version, and they would get arrested and thrown in jail. And then, then you'd have a third group, and the thing that tied them together, other than their desire to overthrow the Canadian government, was that they were all pretty bumbling in their methods. Well, the other thing that tied them together actually is that they were fighting on behalf of Quebec, because Quebec is a French-speaking province in Canada, and so they believed that the colonizers that were the English, represented by Canada. So initially they started to, attack symbols of the colonizers, which were basically federal government buildings, like, army, like armories and so on, which were run by the federal government. And then then you'd have they were all like pretty crazy stuff. Then you'd have like the second group where the guy actually wanted to form his own army. And he literally set up a guerrilla army training camp deep in the woods. And he expected to attract like hundreds, if not thousands of soldiers. But all he could round up was 12 guys. And then you also had, they were so ill-equipped. Like, I mean, first of all, they didn't have, if you have an army, you need to, like, they're basic things. You have to have food, right? You have to feed people. And so they didn't have enough food. They didn't have enough supplies, but they didn't have enough weapons either. They barely had any weapons. So their idea was to rob a gun store, right? Because that's where all the guns are, in the gun store.
It's logical.
And they were just going to like load up the trunk, and that was like, I don't know. They probably would have to make a few trips to the gun store, right? Like if you load up the trunk, you can't do it all in one shot. So I don't think they really thought in terms of long-term plans. Yeah, so it was just like one bumbling thing after another. And I'm not spoiling anything here because it's kind of obvious what would happen. But you rob a gun store with people who are poorly trained, and things will go wrong. And 2 employees of that store were shot and killed by accident.
It is one of the more cinematic moments of the book, like that element of it specifically, where one of the employees is shot by the police.
Right, because it's a gun store. So one of the employees like pulled a gun from off of the wall or from a drawer or something, and of course chased the people who were robbing the gun store.
They were wearing military fatigues, by the way.
Right. Yes, they actually had. This is the other thing. They did have enough money to actually sew their own costumes. Costumes, military fatigues. And
uniforms, but I think costumes
uniforms,
is actually
right.
Probably appropriate
Yes.
in this instance.
Right. So they had that. At least they had their uniforms. And but yeah, as you said, so the police saw this guy with a gun, and they naturally assumed, well, that guy's the robber. So before he could even say anything, like, stop, don't shoot, and then the police basically shot and killed him.
One of the things you said really jumped out at me, this idea that the English are colonizers, because, and it's obvious from the book, and I think, good points are made as far as French-speaking residents of Quebec feeling like second-class citizens, but there really was a colonizing problem in Canada in the same way there was here. It's very strange to be a descendant of these French settlers and consider someone else to be a colonizer of you.
Yeah, it is a funny thing because, of course, and people at the time would not have seen it that way, right? Because people just didn't talk about native rights and so on. But I mean, essentially, you had a dispute between 2 colonizers, because in Canada there were 2 colonizers, so the English and the French, and so the English more or less conquered the French. So the French in Quebec actually had it pretty. Things were terrible for the French in Quebec. I mean, I won't get into so many details here, but it wasn't. Some of it was due to the English in Canada, but there were a lot of other factors, like the Catholic Church were running things in Quebec, and they ran the education system, and it was terrible. Like, for French-speaking people in Quebec, they had almost no access to university. They were sort of streamlined into factory jobs. And as a result, they earned like half the amount of their English-speaking counterparts. So there was a tremendous poverty among French-speaking people in Quebec right through the 1960s. So it took a while. So you could sort of understand, like, I could sympathize with what the FLQ wanted to do, wanting to overturn this, right? Things were pretty bad for French-speaking people, and so the FLQ were right. I sympathize with their desire to want to change things, because things were so terrible for French-speaking people. It's just the way the FLQ went about it was such a disaster.
I honestly can't tell from reading the book what side you come out on, but I guess value of, at very least, property destruction, when it comes to attempting to liberate yourself. But then there's the extra level of being very bad at that as well.
Yeah, right. And the thing is, I mean, I'm by no means an expert in like other revolutionary movements. I have read about others, but others, there are some similarities. That whole bumbling aspect. It seems that like almost every other movement at that time in the 1960s, other liberation movements had similar issues. Like, probably the closest example, using an American reference, would be the Weather Underground, where in 1970 you had 3 members of the Weather Underground who basically accidentally got themselves killed because they were manufacturing bombs in this Greenwich Village it was a house, essentially, that the parents of one of the members owned, and the parents didn't know that their Weather Underground friends were hiding out there. And so they got themselves killed because they were just manufacturing bombs. And so 3 of them were killed, and 2 barely escaped with their lives. So you do have this sense of this haphazard mess. And the other funny story about that Greenwich Village bombing was that, again, so many like haphazard connections here. But the actor Dustin Hoffman happened to be a neighbor. Like, literally, he lived next door. There's actually photos online, so if anyone listening to it, you can look online if you type in Dustin Hoffman Weather Underground. So Dustin Hoffman is running out of his house. I think he's carrying something like a painting. He's like saving a painting from his wall, and with all this smoke coming out like behind him, and somehow that one building completely collapsed. His building seemed to be okay, but he got out just to be safe, of course.
Was this part of your extended research?
Yeah, I mean, I did actually, read about other movements just to try to get a sense of what else was happening in the world. There are several other movements in South America that seem to have this issue. In fact, the FLQ was influenced by one movement in Brazil who did political kidnappings. So yeah, it definitely was of the time.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? I mean, these aren't professionals we're talking about, and
right.
Certainly, I'm going to say men because it's almost exclusively men. There's an unfortunate wife who really gets screwed.
Yes.
But it's just guys. It's white collar guys just making bombs after work.
Yeah, exactly. And in many cases, this tended to be the case with other movements in the world, but definitely was the case with the FLQ, where a lot of the members were actually teenagers, where like sometimes they would recruit teenagers as young as 16. So like one incident in my book, I have them recruiting a 16-year-old, and they literally pick him up at like his high school lunch hour. So like in between classes, his mission is to plant a bomb in a factory. Again, how could that not go wrong, right? But it does. It does go wrong.
It seems clear to me that they weren't trying to kill people. There's just always, you can't account for wrong place, wrong time.
Yeah, that's the other thing too. The other difference between revolutionary movements of that era was that, for the most part, their intention was not to kill people. It was sort of which is kind of hard to sort of grasp, because if you're using like guns and bombs, how could you not want to kill people?
Kill multiple people in the process.
Right. Yeah. So essentially, for them, like, it was always it was more of a symbol. So the bombing would be a symbol against a target, like an armory that would have symbols and so on, a certain symbol. And so this was sort of also something consistent with, let's say, with the Weather Underground did. And so the FLQ did this too. So they would plant a bomb, but they would, after planting the bomb, they would alert the owner of the building. They say, "Hey, there's a bomb. You've got like 5 minutes, and you've got to evacuate." And so that was it. So their intention, and I just wanted to put this out just to try to sort of like cover their bases on their behalf, is that their intention was not to kill people, even though, of course, that's what happened.
That specific instance is very interesting because, the one time they decided that the bomb threat was somebody crying wolf, it wasn't.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
What was your relationship to this material growing up in Quebec?
Well, when I was growing up, like all the events covered in this book were pretty much like all before I was born. I was born like just at the tail end of what happens in this book. And in that period in 1970, I would have been 4 years old. So I don't have any direct memories from this. So when I was growing up, it was mostly over. So I didn't get the sense that people were still talking about it. So yeah, it was only until I was in high school that in my high school class, they showed a documentary on the FLQ, and that's when I sort of really started to like learn about it.
Over the decades, as the idea of Quebec independence has continued, what's your sense of what the public feels about these guys in the story?
It's hard to know because, as I stated in the beginning, like, so much of this is unknown. So I don't think people have an opinion yet of this, because almost no one knows about what I covered in this book. And it has been covered a little bit here and there. There's actually a pretty good podcast by CBC about some of these events. And there's been a couple books that have been made, that have been published in the last few years about this, that covered some of the events. But for the most part, there's not, very few people know about this. While I was working on this book, I would mention some of these events, and pretty much sort of to test like people's knowledge, to see like, is it just me? Am I the only one who doesn't know about this? But every single person I've mentioned this to had no knowledge of any of this.
I was getting conflicting reports as I was reading about your reason for leaving D&Q to make your own books. Some of them were attributing that to your previous book, The Envelope Manufacturer, and some of them were attributing it to this project. Obviously, it's been, as we said at the beginning, 8 years since that happened. Is this something that you've been percolating for that long?
Yeah, I mean, the idea probably came, it's definitely older than, it's been older than 8 years. I probably came up with the idea like over 10 years ago. And I really wanted to do this book. So then I thought, well, first, let me try to do, at that point I had no book done at all. And I had hardly done any cartooning.
You had been doing the same job since you were 23, and it
exactly,
sounds like it kept
yeah.
you very busy.
Right. So there was a huge gap where I literally didn't draw for many, many years. So when I had the idea to do this book, I thought, okay, first, I should have at least one book done. So let me just try to get all my mistakes done before because I really was like enthused about this book on the FLQ. So that let me get my mistakes done with a first book, and then, hopefully this next one will get done. So then I had variations, drafts of the envelope manufacturer done. So I kind of finished it up, and I published it as a book, as its own book. Now the thing is, while I was doing that, I realized that had I continued staying at Drawn Quarterly, there was no way that I would be able to do this book, the book called "Are You Willing to Die for the Cause?" Because it took a long time to do, and there's a lot of research. But I'm also drawing, just drawing it and writing it. That there's just no way you could, or at least no way I would have been able to do it with a full-time job, and so.
And a family.
Yeah, and a family too. At that time, my family was quite young. So there was, there's no way I would have been able to do this. And so that was actually a very large impetus on why I decided to step down from Drawn Quarterly. And of course, it was an important factor was that the people working at Drawn Quarterly sort of like let me do this. People like Peggy Burns and the publisher, and Tom Devlin, the executive editor, and Julia Paul Miranda and Tracy Hearn. I mean, I could keep on going down the list, but the amazing, talented people and accomplished people at Drawn Quarterly, and I'm very sort of honored to have been working with all of them, and I'm really amazed at what they've done with the company. Since I left, but like you could see it obviously even many years before then. But so I knew I had no concerns when I first came up with the idea. When I first approached Peggy Burns and Tom Devlin, they were the first two people I approached, and I didn't have any concerns because I was so much in awe of their talents, and I knew that they would be, running the company in sort of the best possible way.
Yeah, but again, this thing that you were effectively doing since you were in your early to mid 20s, it must be really scary to one day just not be doing that anymore.
I mean, sometimes the scary part was when, I mean, obviously I loved Drawn Quarterly, so yeah, so there was that sense of feeling like, sometimes, sure, sometimes I did wish I was still there.
Yeah, or am I doing the right thing?
Yeah, the part where, am I doing the right thing comes in is like, I was thinking, when I was working on this book, sometimes I really had some severe doubts, and I would, in terms of like, can I pull this off? And then sometimes I would be thinking, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? I've barely had any cartooning experience. How could I even think that I could just step away and do this book and like, so yeah, there were a lot of doubts along the way. There were a lot of those kind of doubts along the way, and it just required a lot of discipline to just keep on going and keep on trying to pull through.
You mentioned the conversation with Tom and Peggy and Julia, but what was the conversation with your family like?
With my family?
Yeah, I mean, as far as like, hey, this steady job that I have, I'm going to become an artist at this stage of my life.
Well, let me see. My three kids, one of them actually was not too happy about it, but I'm still not really sure why. I think he's fine with it now, but at the time he wasn't thrilled. But and then my wife was not too thrilled either, but she's fine with it now.
I mean, I ask because usually when I ask the question, it's like, what did your parents think about you becoming an artist?
Yes.
You weren't making comics at all on the side during that period?
I wouldn't say like during the 25-year period. I would say like there were long stretches. That could sometimes be, 7, 8 years and then maybe do a little bit more, and then so like that first book, The Envelope Manufacturer, was almost entirely done while I was still at Drawn and Quarterly. The summer that I stepped down, I was basically just finishing it up because it literally came out like 6 months later. So yeah, that was a product of like drawing really early in the morning. So because I had the full-time job and then I had young kids at the time, there was a really short period between 5:30 a.m. and 7 a.m. when I could basically draw, and that was it. So that book was done mostly with that kind of schedule.
Yeah, we were talking, and I mean, this conversation comes up all the time on the show. I think it partially has to do with just how long it takes for a cartoonist to make a book. One of the things I've come to recognize is that, again, you seem healthy. I don't think you're dying anytime soon, but mortality can also be a motivator. You know, when you realize that you don't have forever to do these things that you want to do.
Yeah, it definitely makes me focus more. You know, and like I said, I have this goal for this other book that I'm really excited about, and I'm because it's a great story, and I want to get it done. So yeah, I definitely like know what I'm doing over the next 6 or 7 years.
I also just mean from the standpoint of like taking this big leap and leaving the company you founded.
Yeah, you know, I mean, the other thing too was that I had a younger brother who, I think this actually had something to do, like a part of my decision, because around that time, like literally a year or so before I came up the idea of stepping aside from Drawn and Quarterly, I had a younger brother who died very suddenly, and he was only 34. And he died, he had a brain aneurysm, and he literally, like, one day he was there, and the next day he was gone. And then I think I really started having a different sense of life from that point. And even now, it still affects me. Like, we can't take anything for granted. We don't. I think since then, I never even like take for granted that I'll be alive in the next year. And I mean, anything could happen at any age. And so that was sort of like, and again, that happened around that time. And I thought, well, if there's I really want to do more cartooning. And I thought, well, if there's a chance, if I could make this work, if I could pull this off, where I can have this like succession plan for Drawn and Quarterly, and then that way I can also like do some cartooning. I thought, okay, like it's going to be my only, the only way I can get it around to doing this, because otherwise, like I said, it would never have happened if I was working full time at Drawn and Quarterly. And that's the other thing too. Like, it's not so that on the selfish level, that was, I'm talking about like from my perspective of wanting to do cartooning. But the other really important thing is from the perspective of the well-being of an arts company in general. That's actually a really good thing that I don't see happening very often. Like, often you'll have a founder of a company, could be publishing, could be different kinds of arts company, who'll just like hang on for dear life for like no matter what. Like, that was your role when you founded the company, and like your role will not change until you die. I mean, it could be, it really depends on the context, but it really is important to bring in new blood, right? To bring in new perspectives, and to sort of have a change. And I think that is good. I mean, 25 years, that's a long time.
And I'm seeing that in a lot of the content that D&Q is putting out in terms of like having just more diverse artists making books.
Yeah, and that's a great thing too, because like obviously there's been more of an effort in recent years, and that's really important, But at the same time, it's not like it's not like everyone else was kicked out, right? So you still have cartoonists who were with D&Q from the very beginning. So you still have cartoonists who were with D&Q from the very beginning, and doing like some amazing work, fantastic work. I mean, like Seth and Adrian Tomina and Julie Doucet. And I keep on waiting for Chester's next book. I keep on asking him what he's up to. But so you have some fantastic cartoonists, but at the same time, you have like so many fascinating cartoonists who are being brought on now, who weren't there 5 years or 7 years or 8 years ago.
That group that you mentioned, I mean, obviously we lost Joe recently.
Mm-hmm.
He was in that trio, and Julie was the first book you published.
Yeah, Julie Doucet was the first D&Q solo title, and she was soon followed by Palookaville, Seth's comic book, which actually remarkably is still being published today as a hardcover anthology, a one-man anthology, and so. Yeah, and Julie still, just last year, D&Q published a book by Julie. And of course, the latest Palookaville came out a few months ago.
Because Chester just doesn't publish a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I'm really eager to read his next book. Hopefully that's going to be soon.
The sense that I get, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but is that you had no expectations in the early days that you were publishing this, a quarterly, and just, I don't know if it was everything just lined up perfectly. I mean, that's a wild roster for your first few books for like a brand new publisher. And then you got, the distribution deal. Did you have any expectations as far as growth in those days?
Well, I mean, I've said this a few times before, but a lot of it, I think this is the case with a lot of successful businesses. A lot of it, honestly, was a question of being at the right place in the right time, and that one thing I said before is that had I came around as little as 6 months later, possibly even 3 or 4 months later, I would have been too late, and I literally would have missed. So I would have missed Julie Doucet, I would have missed Seth. I would have missed Joe Matt, and then if I did not publish those three, then Chester Brown wouldn't have come on board, because he came on board. Partly because, I offered more money, but also I'm sure he wanted to be with like the cartoonists that he admired so much, and then had all those people not been on board, then a young teenager in Sacramento named Adrian Tomina would not. He would have been influenced by them, but they may have been published by, I don't know, Fantagraphics or Kitchen Sink or something.
He was just a powerhouse too, just right out of the gate. It seems like
he would not have, wanted to publish with this startup company because I wouldn't have had these great cartoonists. So it literally was a question. Like, it literally was months. Possibly as little as 3 months. If I was like 3 months too late, I would have missed it all.
That has to be the most rewarding part of the job, is seeing the way everybody you mentioned has developed.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely the most rewarding thing, because I was just talking about this in another interview today, how you take someone like Julie Doucet, again, the first run of Quarterly Cartoonist, over 30 years, this happened over 30 years ago that I met her and started publishing her. And like, as recently as last year, she won the Grand Prix prize in Angoulême, which is like the highest honor any cartoonist could win, not just in France, but like literally in the world of cartooning. There's no other higher honor you can win. So it's amazing to have had a front row seat to have seen all of this, and then you have all these other cartoonists who who had been nominated for prizes, which would have been unthinkable 30 or even 20 years ago.
I went to the New York premiere of Shortcoming.
Yeah. Oh, that's another level. Yeah, that's a whole other level too. I mean, then having a film adaptation like Adrian Tamina, having a film adaptation where he had this incredible creative control. I mean, he actually wrote the script to the film as well, and was, appears
Got
to
a
have
very
been
funny cameo.
Yeah, and I love this cameo, and of course he went on to become a New Yorker artist as well. So it has been really wonderful to see all that, and to see them develop as cartoonists. Like all those people started out of the gate and as fantastic cartoonists, but then to see them just over the years continue challenge themselves and continue doing this remarkable work. That's just so impressive.
You mentioned the possibility of Adrian getting snatched away from Fantagraphics at the time. Has there been a friendly rivalry between the two companies?
I would say, I would say so. It's just that, I haven't known them that well over the years. I think, other people from D&Q have known them better. But, I think sometimes, things were, they may have been upset or something because if we took a signed up a Fantagraphics cartoonist. But, I think that hasn't happened in many years. So I don't think it's not likely to happen. So, yeah.
There seems to be a mutual respect between the two companies.
Yeah, I'd say so. No, I certainly, admire, so much of what they've done. And actually, I was inspired by a lot of what they've done. Essentially, I remember reading the editorials and the Comics Journal when Gary Groth would still be writing them.
The fact that all of this came together the way that it did, as quickly as it did it derail your plans to become a full-time cartoonist?
I guess it did, because in the beginning, I was drawing. And then that ended pretty shortly afterwards, within that first year. So, it derailed it, but honestly, it was probably for the better, because what I was doing in those early years, I'm talking about when Drawn and Quarterly started. So what I was doing in those early years my cartooning was terrible, over 30 years ago. So I'm glad that there was that. I think I needed a long break to sort of try to sort of, I don't know, become more mature as a cartoonist to make better work.
I think about all the time where I would be if Twitter existed when I was in high school. If I had just put things out into the world like that, because you think at the time the art you're making is great, and then you look back on it and you're like, I dodged a bullet.
Yeah, that's, as you mentioned about Twitter, it's true. It stays there, what you put online. I'm kind of glad that I didn't publish other things when I was 23, because I would have been embarrassed by it. So I'm sort of glad that I got around to it at a much later age, when I sort of had a better sense of what I was capable of.
This is a huge project that you're not done with, so you certainly needed to have all of the skill set to pull that off.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I was reading an interview that you did right around the time that your last book came out, and you said something along the lines of, somebody asked you why it wasn't on Drawn and Quarterly, and you felt like it would be a conflict at the time.
It is a weird thing to have. It's a weird thing to have your work published by the company where you're the publisher. And even though technically I stepped down at that time,
you don't know why they're publishing you. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing too. Is like they don't have a choice. So it is a weird thing. And honestly, even when I was doing this book, I didn't really know. I was just working on the book, right? I wasn't really thinking of what would happen, how it would be published. And it was only after I finished this book, this current book, like I think the day after I finished it, I sent a printout to Tom Devlin. It's like a submission, to see, and he seemed to like it. So I because if he wasn't enthused about it, then I'm not sure. Like, I guess, I don't know. Maybe I'd have to like send submissions out to like different publishers.
You went head down on this thing and didn't show it to anyone until it was done.
Yeah, there were literally maybe a couple of people. One of them was Chester Brown, and he was a fantastic like supporter. And like there were a couple, as I mentioned earlier at some point in their interview, several times they had like sort of a crisis of confidence. And I honestly didn't. I doubted my abilities and so on. So Chester was amazing. He really helped me. He really helped pull me through this. And so I think I sent it to him like three times, like sort of like around the first chapter, kind of and then the middle of the book, and then the very end of the book. The same time I sent it to Tom, and then also. At the end, I sent it to a couple other cartoonists too. Hartley Lynn, who's this fantastic cartoonist here in Montreal. He did the book Young Francis and the comic book series Pope Hats. And then Pascal Girard, who's also another Montreal cartoonist. He's published several great books with Drawn and Quarterly. So yeah, so they were it was really great. And helpful getting their feedback.
I mean, Chester brings a really unique perspective because he's kind of written like the essential Canadian history comic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, he has written the best Canadian, the best book on a Canadian history subject, and of course, just in general, he's a brilliant cartoonist. So it was really helpful to have his guidance on this.
I think in a lot of ways, Kate's latest book is a Canadian history.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Obviously, it's told through her, and it's a very personal book.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So her book is also like I think one of the best books that Drawn and Quarterly has ever published, and I'm referring to Ducks, and it's dealing with history. It's dealing with personal memoir. It's dealing with political issues, current events, and it's told in such an engaging manner. So yeah, no, Kate is also another fantastic cartoonist. That she's been around. It's been actually. I think it's been about a dozen years now. It's been since she's started out with D&Q, which is hard to believe. But yeah, her first book with D&Q was in 2011.
Was that Hark a Vagrant?
Yes.
Yeah. Very interesting career arc there.
Yes, absolutely. Going from Hark a Vagrant to Ducks. And there are a lot of similar elements, but instead of having these one-page strips, you have this really, really ambitious, like 400-page story.
One of the things you mentioned again, and I think it might have been the same interview around the last book, is that there was no time, there was no break between the two. That you immediately threw yourself into this book. Have you already immediately thrown yourself into the second?
I have, but I'm still mostly in the draft stage. Like I'm still writing it. I've done like a lot of sketches and so on. I have sort of like an outline of roughly how long it's going to be. But in terms of doing like from page to page, I did a few attempts that I've sort of tossed out. It's always it's always harder for me to start a new book and I end up like throwing out like quite a few pages.
Le temps qu'on a pris pour dire je t'aime, c'est le seul qui reste au bout de nos jours. Les vœux que l'on fait, les fleurs que l'on sème, chacun les récolte en soi-même.